Long before Israel had kings, prophets, or a temple, there was a story told beside firelight beneath desert stars. A story about why the world exists at all. A story about why human beings carry both glory and ruin inside themselves. A story about gardens, rivers, blood, exile, towers, deserts, famine, dreams, and promises that seem impossible almost from the moment they are spoken. Genesis stands at the entrance of the Bible like an ancient gate. Everything that comes later must pass through it. Without Genesis, the Bible loses its grammar. Covenant loses its roots. Sacrifice loses its meaning. Exile loses its sorrow. And redemption loses the shadow that first made humanity long for light. For many people today, Genesis survives mostly as controversy. Arguments about science. Arguments about history. Arguments about origins. But for ancient Israel, Genesis was not written first as a weapon for modern debates. It was written to reveal who God is, who humanity is, and why the world no longer feels the way it should. The book begins with creation, but it quickly becomes a story about fracture. A fracture between God and humanity, between brother and brother, between earth and heaven, between promise and fear. Yet hidden inside that fracture is another thread, a promise that refuses to die. Again and again, Genesis moves toward collapse. Again and again, something survives. A garden closes. A family line continues. Violence spreads. A covenant appears. Nations scatter. One wandering man is called by name. By the time Genesis ends, the promises of God are still unfinished. Israel does not yet possess the promised land. Death still exists. Exile still waits ahead. And yet the story moves forward anyway. Because Genesis is not merely the story of beginnings. It is the story of a world waiting to be healed. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The Hebrew verb used here is bara, a word the Old Testament uses uniquely for divine action. The earth is described as formless and empty. Darkness covers the deep waters, and the Spirit of God hovers above the chaos. The Hebrew word, ruach, can mean spirit, breath, or wind. Already the world feels alive with movement. Then God speaks. Let there be light. Light arrives before the sun, before the moon, before the stars. The biblical writers are not constructing a modern scientific sequence. They are describing sacred order emerging from chaos. Again and again, God separates light from darkness, sea from sky, land from water. The universe becomes habitable, structured, ordered, good. Ancient Near Eastern cultures often imagined the world emerging through divine conflict. Genesis presents something quieter and more sovereign. Creation obeys immediately. God speaks. Reality responds. Day after day, the world fills with abundance. Trees heavy with fruit. Birds crossing open skies. Creatures moving beneath the sea. The repetition becomes almost liturgical. And God saw that it was good. The world is not evil. Matter is not a prison. Creation itself is declared good before human beings ever appear. This becomes deeply important later in Christian theology. Genesis does not begin with escape from the physical world. It begins with blessing upon it. Then the rhythm slows. The language becomes more intimate. Humanity enters the story. Let us make man in our image, after our likeness. The Hebrew words are Selim and Demet, image and likeness. Scholars and theologians have debated these words for centuries. Some understood them as rationality, others as spiritual capacity, others as humanity's role representing God within creation. In the ancient world, kings often placed statues of themselves across their kingdoms as signs of authority. Genesis makes a shocking claim. Humanity itself is God's living image. Not only kings, not only rulers, human beings, male and female together, dust and breath joined in one creature. Genesis chapter 2 retells creation from another angle. Not as contradiction, but as sacred focus. The man is formed from the ground itself. The Hebrew word for man, Adam, echoes Adamah, meaning soil or earth. Humanity is glorious. But humanity is also mortal. The breath of life enters him from God. Then comes the garden. Eden appears not merely as paradise, but as sacred space. A place where heaven and earth overlap. Rivers flow outward into the world. Trees stand heavy with fruit. Gold and precious stones are mentioned almost strangely early, as if creation already hints toward temple imagery later in Scripture. The man is given work before sin enters the world. To cultivate, to guard. Work itself is not the curse. The curse will come later. Then comes solitude. It is not good that the man should be alone. For the first time in Genesis, something is declared not good. Animals are brought before Adam. He names them, but none are his equal. The woman is formed from his side. Not beneath him. Not above him. Beside him. Adam responds not with command, but poetry. This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. Before shame. Before fear. Before domination. Genesis first gives humanity communion. The garden holds one prohibition. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The command is simple, but the possibility of rebellion already exists. Love without freedom would not truly be love. And freedom carries risk. The serpent enters quietly. Genesis never fully explains where the serpent comes from. The story refuses to satisfy every later question. Instead, evil appears almost like intrusion. A voice twisting trust. The serpent speaks first to the woman. Not with direct denial. With distortion. Did God actually say? The temptation begins with suspicion. The woman sees the fruit. Good for food. Pleasant to the eyes. Desirable for wisdom. The fall is not presented merely as appetite. It is grasping. Taking. Reaching beyond trust. Adam stands beside her. Silent. Then both eat. Nothing explodes immediately. No lightning falls. Instead, awareness changes. They realize they are naked. Shame enters human consciousness. They hide. The first human reaction to sin is concealment. God walks in the garden during the cool of the day. Where are you? The question is not ignorance. It is invitation. Adam blames Eve. Eve blames the serpent. Fracture spreads instantly. The curses that follow touch every part of life. Pain. Conflict. Thorns. Sweat. Mortality. The ground itself becomes wounded alongside humanity. Then comes one of the most mysterious verses in Genesis. God speaks to the serpent about the woman and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. Genesis chapter 3 verse 15 later became known in Christian tradition as the Proto-Evangelium. The first hint of the gospel. Many church fathers saw here the earliest shadow of Christ defeating evil through suffering. Some traditions also connected the woman symbolically to Mary as a new Eve. But within Genesis itself, the verse first functions as a promise that evil will not reign forever. Conflict has entered creation, yet resistance remains. Adam and Eve leave the garden clothed in animal skins. Even here, mercy appears beside judgment. Cherubim guard Eden with flaming swords. Humanity moves eastward into exile. The Bible will remember that direction often. East of Eden. East of blessing. East of home. Outside Eden, humanity begins building civilization. But sin grows faster than cities. Cain and Abel bring offerings before God. Abel offers from the firstborn of his flock. Cain offers from the fruit of the ground. Genesis never gives a simplistic explanation for why one offering is accepted and the other rejected. The deeper issue emerges in Cain himself. Jealousy begins to consume him. God warns him with haunting language. Sin is crouching at the door. Like an animal waiting to devour. Cain invites Abel into the field. then kills him. The first death recorded in Scripture is not natural. It is murder between brothers. Blood cries out from the ground. Genesis portrays creation itself reacting to violence. Cain fears revenge. Yet God marks him for protection. Even judgment still carries restraint. Human civilization develops rapidly afterward. Cities rise. Metalworkers appear. Musicians emerge. Technology advances. But violence expands alongside it. Lamech boasts openly about killing. Human strength becomes pride. The fracture deepens generation after generation. Then Genesis pauses briefly for another genealogy. Ancient readers cared deeply about genealogies. These lists preserved memory, inheritance, identity, and covenant continuity. One phrase repeats relentlessly. And he died. The rhythm becomes almost unbearable. Death reigns through the generations. Yet one figure interrupts the pattern. Enoch walks with God. Then he is gone. Genesis says simply that God took him. A small mystery survives inside the spread of death. Human corruption eventually fills the earth. The thoughts of man's heart was only evil continually. The language is severe. Violence saturates creation. Then comes one of the strangest lines in the Old Testament. God regretted that he had made man on the earth. The text does not imply divine weakness. It expresses grief in human language. The Creator mourns his world. But one man finds favor. Noah. Noah lives in a violent age. The earth is described as corrupted and filled with bloodshed. God commands Noah to build an ark. Not a sleek ship. A massive wooden vessel built for survival. Ancient flood stories existed throughout the Near East long before Genesis was written. The Epic of Gilgamesh contains flood traditions with striking parallels. But Genesis reshapes the flood story around covenant and moral judgment. The flood is not random divine irritation. It is connected to human violence and corruption. Noah gathers animals into the ark. Food is stored. The skies darken. Then the rain begins. 40 days and nights. Waters rise until mountains disappear beneath them. Genesis describes creation itself unraveling. The boundaries established in Genesis chapter 1 collapse. Sea and sky merge again into chaos. Yet inside the ark, life survives. The Church has long interpreted the ark symbolically. Early Christian writers often connected it to salvation and baptism, passing safely through judgment into renewed life. But Genesis first presents it as mercy preserving creation itself. Eventually the waters begin to recede. A raven flies out. Then a dove. Finally the dove returns carrying an olive leaf. The earth breathes again. Noah exits the ark onto silent ground. The first thing he builds is an altar. Smoke rises into the open air. Then comes covenant. The Hebrew word is berith, one of the most important words in all biblical theology. God promises never again to destroy the earth through floodwaters. The rainbow becomes the covenant sign. Not merely decoration after rain. A visible reminder of restraint and mercy. Yet Genesis refuses easy optimism. Even after the flood, human weakness remains. Noah becomes drunk. Shame enters his family. The old fracture survives the new beginning. Humanity multiplies again across the earth. People migrate into the land of Shinar in Mesopotamia. There they begin building a city and a tower, with its top in the heavens. The Tower of Babel is not merely about architecture. Ancient Mesopotamian cities often built massive temple towers called ziggurats. These structures symbolized human attempts to connect earth and heaven. The people of Babel seek unity without dependence on God. Let us make a name for ourselves. Fear drives them. Pride drives them. They do not want to be scattered. Ironically, scattering becomes the result. God confuses their language. Human speech fractures. Nations spread across the earth. Genesis portrays division not as the original design of humanity, but as consequence. The dream of unified human greatness collapses into misunderstanding. Yet directly after Babel, Genesis narrows dramatically. The story of all nations becomes the story of one family. One wandering man in Mesopotamia hears a call. Abram. Abram lives in Ur, one of the great cities of the ancient Near East. The world around him worships many gods. Yet Genesis presents Abram being summoned by one God alone. Go from your country and your kindred. The command carries enormous cost. In the ancient world, identity depended heavily on land, clan, and ancestry. Abram is asked to leave security itself. God promises land, descendants, blessing, and something even larger. Through you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. The covenant story narrows, but its purpose remains global. Abram travels through Canaan as a nomad. Tent after tent, altar after altar. He owns almost nothing. Yet he walks through the land of promise like a man holding invisible inheritance. Genesis does not portray Abram as flawless. He lies out of fear. He doubts. He tries to secure God's promises through human solutions. Years pass without children. Sarai remains barren. In the ancient world, barrenness carried deep social pain. God repeatedly renews the promise anyway. One night Abram stands beneath the stars. So shall your offspring be. Genesis says Abram believed God. Later biblical writers return constantly to this moment. Abraham becomes the model of faith not because he never struggled, but because he continued trusting amid impossibility. Then comes one of the strangest covenant rituals in Scripture. Animals are cut apart, their bodies laid opposite each other. Ancient covenants sometimes used such rituals to symbolize the fate awaiting covenant breakers. But Abram falls into deep sleep. A smoking fire pot and flaming torch pass between the pieces. God alone moves through the covenant. The promise depends ultimately upon divine faithfulness. Abram's name becomes Abraham. Sarai becomes Sarah. Their identities change alongside the covenant. Circumcision becomes the covenant sign carried in the body itself. Years continue passing. Then visitors arrive near Abraham's tent. 3 mysterious figures appear beneath the heat of day. Hospitality becomes revelation. They announce that Sarah will bear a son. Sarah laughs behind the tent wall. Not joyful laughter. Wounded laughter. The laughter of long disappointment. Yet Isaac's very name will preserve that moment. He laughs. Genesis often allows sacred promise to arrive through human weakness. Before Isaac's birth, another dark moment unfolds over Sodom and Gomorrah. The cities become symbols of corruption and injustice. Their destruction later echoes throughout biblical literature. But Genesis also lingers on Abraham pleading for mercy. What if 50 righteous are found there? Then 45. Then 40. Then fewer. Abraham intercedes like a man daring to wrestle compassion from judgment. Lot escapes the city barely in time. Fire consumes the plain. Smoke rises over the valley. Yet even this story refuses simplification. Genesis portrays judgment with sorrow rather than spectacle. Eventually Isaac is born. Sarah laughs again. This time from astonishment. The impossible child survives. But the greatest test still waits ahead. God commands Abraham to offer Isaac. The passage remains one of the most difficult in Genesis. The son of promise. The child long awaited. The future itself. Abraham rises early. Silence dominates the journey. Isaac carries wood up the mountain. Where is the lamb? The question hangs over the story. At the final moment, God stops Abraham. A ram appears caught in the thicket. Sacrifice is offered. Isaac lives. Jewish and Christian interpreters have wrestled with this story for centuries. Christians later saw echoes of Christ carrying the wood of sacrifice. But Genesis first confronts the terrifying tension between promise and obedience. The covenant line continues through Isaac. Yet Isaac himself resembles his father in strange ways. Fear repeats across generations. So does deception. Genesis portrays covenant families with unsettling honesty. Isaac and Rebekah eventually have twins. Esau and Jacob. Even within the womb, conflict begins. Esau emerges first. Hairy. Strong. A hunter. Jacob follows, grasping his brother's heel. The younger brother will overturn expectations repeatedly. Jacob purchases Esau's birthright for stew. Later he steals Isaac's blessing through deception. Blindness fills the scene. Costumes. False skins. A trembling father. Jacob receives the blessing. But victory leaves him fleeing alone into wilderness. Night falls. He sleeps using a stone for a pillow. Then comes the dream. A ladder stretches between earth and heaven. Angels ascend and descend. The place becomes a doorway between worlds. God repeats the covenant promises given to Abraham. Land. Descendants. Presence. Jacob awakens terrified. Surely the Lord is in this place. The wanderer now carries covenant blessing and guilt together. Jacob's life becomes long struggle. He works years for Rachel. He is deceived as he once deceived others. Children are born amid rivalry and sorrow. The future tribes of Israel begin forming through fractured family dynamics. Then one night Jacob wrestles a mysterious figure beside the river. Until dawn, neither victory nor defeat comes easily. Jacob receives a wound and a new name, Israel. He struggles with God. Genesis presents covenant identity not as effortless holiness, but as wounded persistence. Jacob loves Joseph more openly than his other sons. Favoritism poisons the family. Joseph receives special garments, dreams of authority, visions of brothers bowing before him. The resentment grows slowly. Then opportunity arrives in an empty field. Joseph's brothers strip away his robe, throw him into a pit, then sell him into slavery, heading toward Egypt. One brother suggests murder. Another hesitates. The family line itself nearly destroys the chosen son. Jacob believes Joseph is dead. Grief enters the household like permanent winter. Meanwhile, Joseph disappears into Egypt. The story shifts from tents and flocks into imperial civilization. Egypt represents wealth, power, grain, architecture, bureaucracy, and survival. Joseph serves in Potiphar's house. Then false accusation destroys his position. He enters prison forgotten. Dreams continue following him even there. Genesis repeatedly emphasizes hidden providence. God's purposes move quietly beneath human betrayal. Joseph interprets dreams for prisoners. Later for Pharaoh himself. 7 years of abundance. 7 years of famine. Joseph rises suddenly from prison to political authority. The transformation feels almost impossible. Yet the emotional wound remains unresolved. Famine eventually drives Joseph's brothers into Egypt searching for grain. They bow before him without recognizing him. The dreams return fulfilled in painful irony. Joseph tests them slowly. Not from simple revenge. From unresolved grief and caution. Can these brothers change? Benjamin enters the story. Memories reopen. Judah offers himself in sacrifice for his younger brother. The family begins transforming at last. Joseph finally breaks down weeping. I am Joseph. The moment collapses decades of sorrow into one sentence. Fear fills the room. But Joseph speaks words later generations would remember. You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. Genesis does not call evil good. It claims instead that providence can work through human betrayal without approving it. Jacob's family descends into Egypt during famine. Israel survives. But the promised land remains elsewhere. Genesis closes not with triumph, but tension. Jacob blesses his sons before death. Some blessings sound hopeful. Others sound almost like warnings. The future nation of Israel already contains conflict within itself. Then Jacob dies. Joseph mourns his father deeply. The family buries Jacob not permanently in Egypt, but back in Canaan. The land of promise still matters. Even in exile, Joseph's brothers fear revenge after Jacob's death. Again, Joseph speaks peace instead. The covenant family survives not through moral perfection, but through mercy repeatedly given. Joseph eventually dies in Egypt. But before death, he speaks about the future. God will visit his people. They will leave Egypt one day. He asks that his bones be carried with them. Genesis ends strangely. No final conquest. No kingdom. No restoration of Eden. Only a coffin in Egypt. And a promise waiting ahead. From the earliest centuries, Christians returned constantly to Genesis. Irenaeus described Christ as the new Adam who reverses humanity's failure. Where Adam grasped wrongly, Christ obeyed faithfully. Early Christian writers often described Mary as a new Eve whose obedience answered Eve's disobedience. Augustine reflected deeply on creation, time, and the human heart in Genesis. Ephraim the Syrian filled his writings with poetic reflections on Eden and paradise. John Chrysostom emphasized the emotional realism of the patriarchs. Ambrose explored the moral and spiritual dimensions of creation and covenant. The flood became linked symbolically to baptism. The ark became an image of salvation carried safely through chaos. Abraham became the father of believers. Melchizedek, the mysterious priest-king who blesses Abraham with bread and wine, later gained enormous significance in Christian theology through the book of Hebrews. Yet the Church also understood that Genesis contains layers: literal, symbolic, typological, moral, theological. Christian interpretation developed carefully across centuries rather than through simplistic one-to-one symbolism. Modern scholarship has also raised difficult questions about authorship, composition, historical memory, and literary structure. Traditionally, Genesis was attributed to Moses. Many modern scholars instead argue the text developed through long processes of transmission and compilation. Faithful Christians hold different positions regarding these debates. But Genesis has remained enduringly powerful across those discussions. Because its deepest questions remain human questions. Why is the world beautiful and broken at the same time? Why do human beings long for eternity while returning to dust? Why does violence repeat generation after generation? Why does hope survive anyway? Genesis begins with creation. It ends with a coffin. The movement feels almost tragic. Humanity was formed for communion with God. Now the covenant family lives outside the promised land surrounded by death. And yet Genesis refuses despair. The promises remain alive beneath unfinished history. The story is still moving. Exodus waits ahead. So do Sinai, kings, prophets, exile, return, and eventually the strange hope of resurrection. The Bible never truly leaves Genesis behind. Its themes echo constantly: garden, exile, brother against brother, flood, covenant, sacrifice, blessing, promise, a wounded humanity still searching for home. Perhaps that is why Genesis continues speaking across thousands of years. Because it understands humanity with unsettling clarity. It knows the fear hiding beneath ambition, the loneliness inside exile, the grief carried through generations, the hunger to become more than dust. But Genesis also insists that history is not abandoned. Again and again, when collapse seems final, a promise survives. A child is born. A family continues. An ark floats. A covenant appears. A dream returns. A blessing passes forward wounded but still alive. By the end of Genesis, humanity has not returned to Eden. The sword still guards the garden. But the story now moves toward redemption instead of silence. And somewhere in Egypt, waiting beside the bones of Joseph, the road to Exodus has already begun.